When he went out the next day, behold, two Hebrews were struggling together. And he said to the man in the wrong, Why do you strike your companion? He answered, Who made you prince and judge over us? Do you mean to kill me as you killed the Egyptian? Then Moses was afraid and thought, Surely the thing is known. When Pharaoh heard of it, he sought to kill Moses. But Moses fled from Pharaoh and stayed in the land of Midian.
Running for your life was perhaps the last thing you had in mind when you started on this journey with God. Yet here you are, the famed Prince of Egypt, now at the top of Egypt's most wanted list. Your last night in the palace was one of intense anxiety. You killed a man. If it had been an Israelite, it would have been inconsequential. But this was no Israelite you killed. It was an Egyptian. Egyptian lives actually meant something, and even a man living in the royal palace could be held accountable for such an act. Over and over again, you replay the events of the last few days in your mind. Everything had changed so drastically. It was like a sandstorm. The feeling of utter failure haunts you, like the faces of the people you desperately long to save. Was the foundation that your world was built on just a vain ideal? Was it even real? Were you not told that the freeing of your people lay in your very capable hands? You had expected your people to rise up with you, throw down their shovels and hammers, and willingly fight their way out of Egypt, rather than continue under Pharaoh's cruel whip, to actually do something about the injustice they had endured for decades. You understood their fear, after all. You had lived in the palaces they had built. How could they see you as a leader? But really, there was no one to lead? The Israelite nation had a rich history that was being lost as generation after generation were born into slavery. Already, many of the customs and important laws of your God were looked upon as just mere fables by the younger generation. Something had to happen, and soon. Otherwise, there wouldn't be a nation left worth saving. There wasn't one little handful of people willing to be organized into a God-ordained revolution. Where was their faith in God? The opportunity for something monumental had been there, so close you could taste it, but it was over as quickly as you'd started it. Now here you are, for the first time in your life, tasting the bitterness of losing instead of the sweetness of triumph. You were aimlessly running, like a coward. Traveling through this hot desert on your own was probably the hardest thing you had done by yourself in a long time. This was the type of topography you had chariots and horses for, but all you had today were your 2 feet. You had looked for old ragged clothes to disguise yourself in, but everything in your closet was one of royalty and definitively Egyptian. You pray no one would see you here, in the wilderness, recognize your face, or worse yet, call you out for your moment of violent justice. Moses, the name which means pulled out, had not only been taken from the grip of the Nile, but now pulled away from both the Egyptians and the Israelites. You find yourself a man without any family or any people who truly accepted you. It was time for a new start. Well, as long as you survived this aimless wandering of no man's land, what kind of life could be found in such a place? Agonizing days pass as you travel through the harsh desert, alone in the land of Midian about 250 miles away. The sun is constantly beating down on you in the blistering sun, while at night you shiver to stay warm. This was barren, dangerous country. The influences which had surrounded you in Egypt were numerous and convincing, but now there's no trace of these distractions anywhere, only heat and deafening quiet. You wonder if those circling vultures in the distance were for some poor wounded animal, or were they waiting for you? You had hastily thrown together a bag of basic necessities as you fled the temple of this man-god, but those provisions were running low, especially your wineskin. The distant jagged rocks and cliffs reminded you of the dramatic 90-degree angles on the magnificent temples of the royal palaces and magnificent burial pyramids of great men. But if you died here, there wouldn't be anything to even mark your grave. Deeper and deeper into nowhere you walk as you banish yourself into a place of exile. There is no sign of royalty in this seemingly God-forsaken place. But this is exactly where God would speak to you. This is exactly where God wanted his man. You couldn't know this now, but this barrenness would be home for the rest of your life.
Wow, Garrett. There was a lot there in that narrative that we just listened to.
Yeah, it's interesting because we're kind of going really slow. Some of our listeners might be saying, okay, we're not even through Exodus 2.
Yeah, are they dragging it out?
Yeah,
that might be a question.
We're not trying to drag it out at all, but we're trying to not just use our imaginations, but we're trying to use other places in the Bible that illustrate some interesting, I guess, illustrations and fills the gaps a little bit of Exodus chapter 2 itself. So we might not have moved much in Exodus itself, but the story, I think that the rate that we're going, it's a good thing.
Yeah, I think so, because it allows us to soak in some of the principles that we're trying to highlight in the story of Moses. Now, at this point, we find him on the run.
Yeah, so if you remember last episode, Moses has been a step ahead of God, and he lashed out.
Killed a guy.
Killed an Egyptian. Yeah. And that was in our introduction here today. And looked for a bag, and off he went.
Yeah, tried to help out the Hebrews too, and they rejected him as well.
Yeah, so Moses was incredibly misunderstood, right? Yeah. And of course, God was the most misunderstood out of everyone in this story. But yeah, so Moses just has what's with him, and he runs away for perhaps the first time in his life facing failure. And
rejection. Which is interesting when you think about it, because Moses was facing not just failure, but rejection in his 40s.
Right, which is interesting. And not to be redundant, I don't think this is being too redundant, but we've already learned that Moses was a very successful person at 40. He's in the prime of his life. The Bible has said that, he had a military training. Josephus mentioned this. We talked about it. So, yeah, Moses is 40. He's in the prime of his life. He's ready to conquer the world, right?
Yeah.
He's got the training, maturity, the strength, and then he blows it.
Yeah. Just crazy. I mean, there's a lot to learn, and that's why we're taking it slow. So where are we now in the story?
Yes, we're in Exodus chapter 2, verse 15, and you might be saying, well, this is where we were last time. No, we're taking this nice and easy. So, Exodus 2:15, one specific part of it says this, when Pharaoh heard of it, he sought to kill Moses, and Moses fled from Pharaoh and stayed in the land of Midian.
Yeah, actually, we didn't touch verse 15 in our last.
Oh, we didn't touch it at all? Okay.
I don't think so, because we touched him trying to figure out the dispute between the two Hebrews, and I don't think we talked about Pharaoh's reaction to Moses.
We didn't talk about him trying to kill Moses, though.
No, I don't think so.
Yeah, well, Moses,
which, even if we did, it's fine.
It's fine. But Pharaoh wants to kill him.
Yeah, I mean, that's the point. The point is that Moses is an infamous character in Egypt at this point.
Now he's an outlaw.
He is on the list. The most wanted list, dead or alive.
Yeah, I grew up with Westerns, and this is very much a Western scene. Like,
this is very.
He goes into the desert. There's wanted posters in my mind's eye.
Yep. There's plants that are blowing in the wind.
A tumbleweed.
Tumbleweed. Yeah. I just imagine him walking, and there's a tumbleweed blowing by.
Except Moses is dressed in Egyptian garb.
Yeah, I mean, he looks fancy.
Yeah, we'll show you why we know that in a few minutes. But
so he's on the run. He's going to Midian, and we're going to talk about him being in Midian, but. Why is he going this direction? Like, what is this? Why is this the response of Moses at this point in time? Why do you think?
I think that's a great question. Moses, I think, has a lack of options, and Moses is going to a place where he knows that there's probably some distant family and also a good opportunity for not being noticed at all. I mean, Midian is about 250 miles away. Yeah. They're nomadic people. You have to cross a desert to get there. So this is a pretty safe place, a pretty safe bet for Moses.
Yeah.
It's probably one of the last options that he has left at all, regardless. So, but in order to do that, he has to kind of risk his life to get there.
Yeah, so the idea here is that he's attempting to start over. Get to a place where he's unknown. Because obviously now he's infamous. So going to a place where no one knows him might be a good way to blend in. Why do we respond to failure this way?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's very, very difficult. Like you mentioned already, it's very difficult to restart your life in a place that you already have a reputation, where people already know you, and they already might even have a prejudice, whether it's earned or not, against you, right?
Yeah.
And so Moses is looking to start fresh. And I really believe that this is from the leading of God, too, because God has something to do with Moses here in the desert.
Yeah.
Interestingly enough, I think we talked about this a little bit offline, but Jesus spends 40 days in the wilderness. He's tempted of the devil, right?
Yeah.
Moses spends 40 years in the wilderness. And I don't think he's tempted from the devil, but I think the desert is a pretty quiet place.
I mean, there's a lot of testing in the desert, though. I mean, even if it's not the devil that's testing you, I mean, your thoughts are going to be running through your mind because the silence is going to illuminate all of those crazy thoughts that might have been silenced by the noise.
And
You know.
that's what we tried to kind of bring across in our opening narration is Moses kind of doing this mental downward spiral, right?
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
he was ratted out probably by an Israelite and he was rejected. You know, we talked about all that. So Moses is probably having a really difficult mental time and he's having a identity crisis too.
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
everything that his identity is based off of is now gone.
Yeah. Yeah.
And he's 40.
Yeah. So I have an experience that I wanted to share with you.
Yeah, sure. Go ahead.
Wanted to get your thoughts on. It's sort of the opposite side of this because I know Moses then. We talked about Moses here being the fact that Moses is rejected, right? But I also would consider that Moses might have been hurt too,
Yeah.
right? Because it's not just that he made a mistake, I mean, which is what we said earlier. But he's also feeling that deep hurt. And I thought about the fact that it's not just that the lack of acceptance, but it's also sometimes the wounds that you experience that makes it hard for you to stay in a place,
Totally.
right? And so when you think about some of those negative experiences, I mean, people move all the time because of those reasons. Like, man, that didn't work out for me. That ended really bad. So I'm going to move to a different
Yeah,
state.
let's kick the dust off this town.
Yeah, let me go to this other spot because perhaps starting over might be a good idea. And we do that not just with life in general, but we do that in church sometimes, right? This person hurt me in church, so therefore I'm not going back. Right?
Isn't
We
that-
kind of move away.
As
Right?
pastors, we see that a lot, right?
We do.
Someone gets their feathers ruffled or something like that, and they leave, or you get someone coming to your church and they're like, "Hey,
Yeah.
we're coming from here."
Yeah. I had a good friend, and the reason why I mentioned that is I had a good friend, man, just really, really, really smart guy. Loved talking with him, and we were talking, and we were just kind of got to the topic of church and church hurt, and he's like,
Sure.
"Hey, hey, pastor, man, I feel like I'm in a desert right now."
You can be in a desert where there's lots of people around.
Yeah, yeah, and that's the way he worded it. It's
Yeah.
like I just feel like I was hurt so bad that the place that I find myself is I'm not anywhere, but I am somewhere, and where I am is like a desert. It's no man's land, which is the title of this episode.
Yeah, I think every single one of us in our spiritual life, we see it with Jesus. We're seeing it here with Moses. We'll see it later with the Israelites. But I think every one of us goes through a wilderness experience, not just in our mental life, but like I just mentioned, in our spiritual life as well.
Yeah.
I mean, your life with God has its valleys. But what's great about being in the desert, specifically in the story of Moses, I found it interesting. In Hebrew, desert is translated as Debar, which means the place of speaking.
Interesting.
So it's a silent, desolate, dangerous place, and yet it's a place of speaking.
That's interesting.
Seems-
So who's talking?
Yeah, who's talking?
Yeah, who's talking
Right?
in the bar?
Well, it doesn't seem like that God's doing a lot of talking to Moses within the text,
Yeah.
but I'm sure that there's a conversation that's going on there because Moses has a lot to learn. And as we know, it's not just going to be a few days in the wilderness, but Moses is going to spend the rest of his life here.
You know, I would assume too that Moses probably was doing a lot of talking.
Oh,
Because,
yeah.
I mean, when you've gone through 40 years of nothing
Kind of word vomit.
and you try
Yeah.
and that effort results in failure, I mean, you would do a lot of talking.
Yeah.
I mean, I remember one experience that I had, and I mean, it was very, very difficult. And I remember feeling that feeling of like, man, I'm sort of in no man's land right now. You know, we talked about the house. That was an overwhelming experience, and there were a lot
remember.
of why questions that I was asking God, like why did we have to end up in a situation where we couldn't afford anything other than a fixer-upper?
Yep.
And going through that experience, like I feel like, man, I'm alone in this desert, and I am doing a lot of talking and not a lot of listening.
Yeah.
Because I just feel like there's so much frustration that I need to pour out and need to talk to God about. And so, yeah, man, I was praying a lot. And yeah, then you get to the point where you run out of things to say. And then God actually starts talking to you.
I think it's a good thing for us to do that with God. Like God doesn't get burned out or tired of us talking to him.
Yeah.
I mean, David does that in the Psalms. He
Yeah.
pretty much goes through every emotion in the book with God.
Yeah.
In one moment, he's saying, God, murder my enemies. Then the
Yeah.
next moment, he's like, Lord, whatever your will is, that's what I want.
Yeah.
So I think
yeah,
I think God likes us to do that, but you're right. We eventually do run out of things to say. And so Moses is probably doing a lot of word vomiting with God. He's probably
Yeah.
narrating the experience, even though God has already been there. He's seen it. And eventually Moses probably does run out of some things to say. And as we know, God is really, really going to speak. But in the desert, I mean, if Moses was back in Egypt, Egypt probably has a lot to keep Moses occupied, right? I mean, it was the modern center of the world at that time.
Yeah.
And so Moses would have had a battle to plan for. He would have had something to design. I mean, Moses was probably a pretty busy guy with lots of different distractions. And I think sometimes we have so much mental stimulation and so much going on in our lives. I mean, you know, you're driving down the road and there's just so much mental stimulus that's happening to you even when you're driving.
Yeah.
That I think it's sometimes hard for God to break through.
Yeah. Man, I keep imagining this place of anguish. And do you mind if I go a bit further with that?
No, go for it.
Because you mentioned David the psalmist. Another person that I thought about was Jeremiah.
Oh,
I mean, there's
same
a
thing.
whole book
Yep.
dedicated to this anguish that one's feeling
The
about a
lamenting.
situation. Yeah, the book of Lamentations. So this is Lamentation chapter 3.
Yep.
And notice what he's saying, right? Because this is a prayer, right? He's speaking. And he says, I am the man who has seen affliction by the rod of his wrath. Right? He's talking about God. Lamentation chapter 3, verse 2. He has led me and made me walk in darkness and not in light. Surely he has turned his hand against me time and time again throughout the day. He has aged my flesh and my skin and broken my bones. He has besieged me and surrounded me with bitterness and woe. He has set me in dark places like the dead of long ago. I mean, this guy is like talking about, and the he is talking about here is God. It's like God is hedging me into this experience that makes it so challenging, right? And we talked about the fact that Moses had nowhere else to go.
No. Exactly. Moses has nowhere else to go, and he's probably doing a lot of lamenting, like you just said.
Yeah.
And there might be a bit of Moses as well, like he might be a little bit angry. I mean, he just got sold out from his people. And we talked about this last episode too, but maybe he thinks that his opportunity as the savior of Israel is gone.
Yeah. Yeah.
And even if he does get another opportunity, why would I go back
Yeah. Why would I go back?
and help those people?
So listen to this again. Lamentation chapter 3, which I think paints a really cool picture of what we're talking about. Again, the prophet is praying. He says, I have become the ridicule of my people, their taunting song all the day. He, meaning God again, has filled me with bitterness. He has made me drink wormwood. He has broken my teeth with gravel and covered me with ashes. You have moved my soul far from peace. I have forgotten prosperity. And I said, my strength and my hope have perished from the Lord.
That's depressing stuff.
I mean, it is pretty depressing. I mean, I guess the desert is a depressing place, right? When you think about it.
Yeah.
Right. But the reality of it is, like we said in the last episode, sometimes God has to cut you down in order to transplant you. Right. And even though you go through that phase or that series or that moment of this is a depressing thing to read, but the reality is you come to the realization that, man, only God can actually fill my joy.
Absolutely. And the desert is also a good place to, it's a good example. It's a good symbol of when we have actions that are not according to the will of God. We end up getting, the consequences of our actions are often very much like a wilderness.
Yeah.
For instance, like during the millennium, the 1,000 years, the world is reduced to rubble. It's just a wilderness, right?
Yeah,
Because of the choice of sin.
Yeah.
Moses has definitely, I would say, sinned there, killing the Egyptian.
Yep, that's fair.
And the repercussions of that is now he's in a wilderness. And that's directly because of his choice that he made. And so often when we become, not all the time, but sometimes when we get to a storm in life, sometimes it's a storm of our own making, sometimes it's not.
Yeah.
But regardless of whether we made the storm or not, God is still there.
Yeah.
And he's ready to speak.
Yeah. So again, we've talked about this a bit earlier, but I want to go sort of in a different direction now.
Sure.
And that's the irony of the desert and the history that is associated with it, especially with regard to Moses and his people.
Sure.
One thing that we've been doing in this podcast so far is we've been kind of revisiting the story of Joseph and connecting that with Moses. And we jump forward and also connect with Jesus and his experience as well.
Closely connected.
Which is just really, really pivotal and powerful. But the thought that I have is, if you look at Genesis, this idea of Midian.
Yeah. Kind of distant cousins.
Yeah, distant cousin. I kind of wanted to find out, well, was Midian mentioned in any other story? And you'd be surprised that Midian was actually mentioned in the story of Joseph. Do you mind reading this verse for us? It's Genesis 37.
Sure.
verse 28, and I think 28 to 36, actually.
28 to 36.
I think so.
Then
Or we could probably skip around.
I'll
based
jump
on-
around. Verse 28, though. Then Midianite traders passed by, and they drew Joseph up and lifted him out of the pit. So this is where the brothers left
Yeah,
him. Right?
yeah.
So Midianites, and this is where Moses goes, right?
Yeah, he goes to the Midianites.
And so we know that the beginning of Midian is one of Abraham's wives, his second wife. That's the beginning of Midian. So
okay.
just so we know that. So anyway, the Midianites traders passed by. They drew Joseph up and lifted him out of the pit and sold him to the Ishmaelites for 20 shekels of silver. They took Joseph to Egypt. So the first people that
Bought him.
were these Midianite
Midianites.
traders.
Wow.
That's pretty ironic, isn't it?
Isn't that crazy?
Yeah.
So the Midianite traders bought Joseph and sold him to the Ishmaelites, who then delivered Joseph to Egypt.
Yeah, they're part of the step. They're
Yeah.
part of the journey.
Yeah. And now Moses is fleeing to the Midianites.
Yeah.
Isn't that ironic?
It is very ironic. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's funny how the Bible does things like this. It keeps
Takes our
circling
mi-
back.
Yeah.
Over and over and over again. Yeah, it's interesting stuff. But anyway, Moses finds himself back in the wilderness. It's interesting though, because we often, when we're in those storms in life or we're in deserts in our life, I often ask myself the question like, okay, I'm in this difficult place. What do we do when we are in these places? Like, am I trying to do everything that I can to get out of the wilderness and try and get out of the storm? Or do I let God keep me there until he's done with me being there and gets me out? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Because sometimes I think we get so panicked about being in these difficult places in our life that we do everything that we can to claw our way out of it.
Yeah.
But I think sometimes God wants us to be patient when we are in these unfortunate situations that might be testing and
Yeah.
really pulling us.
I think so. So my wife and I, when we went to Arizona, we decided to go on a hike.
Cool.
Arizona is dry, arid.
This is a couple years ago.
Yeah, I forgot. We were still dating. We weren't married yet, I don't think.
Okay, gotcha.
Man,
Man, hiking when you weren't married?
Wait,
yet?
we
Wow.
were at GYC actually.
We were the
Phoenix. There was a GYC in Phoenix.
not like this previous one, but before you were married.
Yeah, this was. Wait, you know what, man? We might have been married at the time. No, we were married. We were married.
I was gonna say hiking, and you're not.
Yeah,
married,
yeah.
man.
No,
That
we were
sounds-
married. No, we had friends with us too.
kidding, I'm
Anyway,
kidding.
you're trying to get me in trouble here. But anyway, we went hiking and we noticed that even in a dry and arid place, growth is still possible.
Yeah, it's sparse, but it's there.
It's there, and I think. I mean, we took a picture beside a cactus, for example. I mean,
As you do.
the thing was just so tall. Like you could tell that this thing was growing. And going back to what you were saying earlier, I think a lot of times what we miss in the desert is that we miss the point of the desert. The point of the desert is so that we can grow.
Yeah, but we want out.
We want out.
Yeah.
So we miss the opportunity of growth. And now when you're in the desert, the only thing that you're competing for is growth, actually.
Yeah, absolutely. It's like going to the gym, man. Like a lot of people that just start working out don't like going to the gym. The best part is leaving.
Yeah.
Because it's pain.
Yeah. Yeah.
The whole time.
Yeah.
But I've been to that desert. I've been to the desert of Midian. I've been here. It's around Mount Sinai, right?
Yeah.
In that area, and there is some growth there. It's very, very sparse. It's pretty much only a few inches tall, very minimal. But I tell you, anything that's alive in that desert is probably out to kill you. I mean, or it's a bird of prey. Like it is desolate. It is quiet. There is nothing going on, even to this day.
Really?
So yeah, not a great place to be,
Yeah.
especially when you're used to living in a palace, with people waiting on you hand and foot.
Yeah.
Quite a culture shock.
Yeah. I mean, that's a big, big change. So I guess one thing that might come up here too is the problem of loss of identity.
Oh,
like
absolutely.
You just contrasted the palace to the desert. Like you're in this new place, new environment. Who are you? Right? Yeah. You're so out of place, dressed like an Egyptian in the desert of Midian.
Yeah, it's a total identity crisis, especially at 40 years old. I think young people have it's a common psychological term that it's kind of batted around in today's conversations. But have you ever heard of like imposter syndrome? where, like, okay, these are the things that I'm doing. This is the job that I'm working, but I don't think I'm qualified for any of it.
I don't feel like I belong.
I don't feel like I
stuff,
belong. And I'm just faking it till I make it kind of a thing.
That's crazy.
So identity crises are real.
So I spoke to some young people not so long ago, actually, and I brought up this example of growth.
Mm-hmm.
And I brought a fake plant up front with me.
Sure.
They kind of chuckled at the idea that this pastor was walking around with a fake plant, like a fake tree.
Okay.
And I had a bottle of water, and I attempted to pour the bottle of water on it. But I asked a question before I poured the water. Will this plant grow if I water it?
Yeah, no, not going to
happen. It will not, right? It doesn't matter what nourishment I pour into it. The issue is the thing cannot grow because it's fake. And I think that's how we lose sight of the desert experience again. We don't grow because we're pretending, we're faking it. You see what I'm saying? And I think the reality of the story is that Moses was not faking anything.
No.
He was
very real.
He was being very, very real in the desert of Midian, right? And that takes a lot of humility.
Which is a relief, because I'm sure that a part of Moses, as he's there in the palace, a lot of it is being something that he knew he wasn't. Moses wasn't nobility. Moses was an Israelite, so he was he was playing a part that he knew wasn't him.
Yeah.
So now that he's in those wilderness, all of that is gone.
Yeah.
And he's just left with him, his own thoughts, and God.
Yeah.
And that's all. And I go ahead.
I was going to say that I think Moses brings this up later in Deuteronomy chapter 8.
I was just going to read that.
Go ahead, because we're thinking the same thing on that.
Yeah, so Deuteronomy 8, if you're asking the question of why the Lord led Moses into the wilderness, this is your answer. Deuteronomy 8:2 says, "And you shall remember the whole way that the Lord your God led you these 40 years in the wilderness, that he might humble you, testing you to know what was in your heart, whether you would keep his commandments or not." So this is talking about the Israelites for the 40 years, but I think it also applies with Moses, right?
Well, Moses is the one talking.
Yeah, Moses is the one writing this.
I mean, so he understood and he experienced it himself.
Absolutely.
Right? Moses was not, I mean, I can't imagine Moses being a humble guy, right, during his time in Egypt, right?
No.
I mean, he didn't have any reason to be humble.
That's not the nature of the game.
No. I mean, when you're in the palace, I mean, that's a whole different lifestyle, right?
Yeah.
The other thing is, I think we often think of humility as a negative thing as well, which
like weakness.
Yeah, we think of it as weakness. And when we read like the Lord will humble you, we often think of it as he will afflict you, or it's always seen in the disciplinary context, right? But that's true. But there's another side to that I want us to take a look at. And that's the next text that I wanted to read is Deuteronomy 29 and verse 5. Because on the one hand, Deuteronomy 8 is mentioning that God will humble you.
Yeah.
But Deuteronomy 29 and verse 5, it says, "And I have led you 40 years in the wilderness. Your clothes have not worn out on you, and your sandals have not worn out on your feet. You have not eaten bread, nor have you drunk wine or similar drink, that you may know that I am the Lord your God." Right? So the text there in Deuteronomy chapter 29 is highlighting the fact that even though they're going through the process of being humbled,
sure,
on the other hand, God is also taking care of every single need they had.
And that's just it, because I mean, I'm jumping a little bit to the story of Jesus. When Jesus is there and he is in a storm in a boat with his disciples, Jesus is fast asleep in that boat, right? And his disciples are doing everything they can to bail out the boat. And they're expert mariners, right? Like, they know what they're doing. They've been doing this their entire lives since they were children, and they're doing everything they can to get out of this storm, and they absolutely panic and they can't do it. Then they remember that Jesus is there, and Jesus calms the storm. So even when Jesus leads us into places where it's stormy and that we're uncomfortable and we're being stretched and we just want to get out, I think it's important to remember that Jesus is still with us.
Yeah, he's
right?
there too. Yeah.
So even if it is painful and we hate it, he's still there.
Yeah.
And that should be enough comfort for us.
Yeah. And if he's there with us, we're bound to see some amazing things.
Yeah, and especially if he led you there. And Jesus is the one that led you there, then it's his problem.
Yeah, exactly. So we cry at the storm. We want to run out of the boat, want to jump ship. But if we wait long enough, and if we enlist him to do something for us in those moments, I mean, we're bound to see something miraculous. So again, Deuteronomy 29, Moses, when he speaks to the children of Israel, he says, "You have seen all that the Lord did before your eyes in the land of Egypt."
Right.
To Pharaoh and to his servants and to all his land, the great trials which your eyes have seen, the signs and those great wonders. So he mixes those three things together. There's trials, there is signs, and there are great wonders, right? And then it says in verse 4, yet the Lord has not given you a heart to perceive, and eyes to see, and ears to hear, to this very day. And that what he's mentioning there is that they were so rebellious that even though there were these prominent signs and wonders and so on and so forth, they still couldn't trust God in the desert. And as a result, they couldn't understand what God's purpose was in the end.
Yep, going back to Jesus' disciples, different storm, but Peter's there and he's on the water.
Yeah, different storm, same people.
Different storm, same people. And he gets so distracted by the storm that he takes his eyes off Jesus and he starts sinking, right?
Yeah.
It's the same thing. There's so many blessings around us, but we get so focused on ourselves and so focused on the trial and the pain that we just self-collapse. And I think this is what Moses is in danger of here when he's here in the wilderness, because even though God has led him there, and even though it's a place that God can talk to him, Moses is still in danger of forgetting.
Yeah, yeah. Man, so here's another verse on that, which is, I'm happy you brought that up because that's a great risk that we run when we're in the desert. So notice this, Psalm 106. This is David writing, verse 21. It says, the children of Israel, again, same children of Israel, he gives us this warning. He says in verse 21, they forgot God, their Savior, who has done great things in Egypt.
Yeah.
Isn't that a crazy charge?
That's pretty amazing.
Right? God led them out of Egypt, but they forgot God, their Savior, who had done great things in Egypt.
Yeah.
Right? That's the risk. And then it says wondrous works in the land of Ham, awesome things by the Red Sea. So David is listing all the things that God has done, but they forgot. Therefore, he said that he would destroy them had not Moses, his chosen one, and I love this, had not Moses, his chosen one, stood before him in the breach to turn away his wrath, lest he destroy them. So he's talking about Moses' sensitivity to the children of Israel in that he stands between God and them, which we'll talk about in another episode.
Yeah, we'll get there.
But then it adds, verse 24, then they despised the pleasant land because they did not believe his word.
Yeah, there you have it.
But complained, verse 25, in their tents and did not heed the voice of the Lord. So there are a couple things here.
Yeah.
They forgot God. They despised the future that God was wanting them to experience. And they complained in their tents all the way along.
It's true.
Isn't that us?
It is us. There's a difference, though, between Moses and the children of Israel because they both leave Egypt and they both go towards Sinai, right?
Yeah, that's right. Midian.
Midian, which is in that Gulf of Aqaba area. So they both go that direction towards the wilderness, but there's a difference between Moses and the children of Israel. The children of Israel, when they are finally freed from Egypt, they're leaving as slaves. Like, it can't get much worse than this. Like, they're going from a place of destitution to hopefully the promised land, right? Within a few days is their hope, right?
Yeah.
So they've got nothing to lose. Moses, on the other hand,
had everything to lose.
Yeah, so it has everything to lose. So the Israelites are going from rags to riches, and Moses is going from riches to rags. He's going the opposite direction.
That's crazy.
So the children of Israel have a lot more to be excited about, and Moses has a lot more to complain about, right?
But he never complains.
But he doesn't. And that's it's an interesting difference between the two. Moses does not complain. I don't think we have an instance of him complaining about God's leading in
the whole time.
The Old Testament.
Yeah.
We have him complaining about the children of Israel.
Yeah, but not God's leading.
But not God.
Yeah.
Which is very interesting.
We do find him pleading with God, though.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
On occasion.
Yeah, absolutely.
But
not like rebellious complaining like his people.
Yeah. Man, that's crazy. Yeah, no, he gave up everything.
Yeah, he gave up everything. So he gave up a lot, and the children of Israel really don't give up anything.
Yeah.
Although they do say, well, it is worse when we die, which I guess that's true, but God's not going to let that happen.
Their morbid thoughts. And
and
their cynical attitude.
Yeah, you wonder if any of that ever crossed Moses' mind. Like, okay, am I going to make it across this wilderness? Because 250 miles is a long way.
Yeah. Yeah. That is crazy. Okay, what else are we looking at with this?
Well, there's a lot more. So when we do know that Moses, when he gets to Midian, we know that he's still dressed as an Egyptian, so he still looks very much like the place where he came from. The reason we know that is Exodus chapter 2, verse 19, when The shepherdesses find him. They tell their dad an Egyptian came.
Yeah, an Egyptian, yeah.
So Moses still very much looks the part. So Moses is still Egyptian, right, in their minds. And I'm sure they find out later that he's like a distant relative.
Yeah.
But anyway, I find that interesting that,
Can we read that verse? Because that's
Yeah.
actually very important.
Yeah, go ahead.
Exodus 2 and verse 19.
Yeah, that's the
and
one.
they said, an Egyptian delivered us.
yeah, wild, isn't it?
An Egyptian delivered us from the hand of the shepherds and also drew enough water for us and watered the flock. It's very interesting that Moses is doing deliverance in Midian.
It's true. And I don't want to blow too much that episode because we have a whole episode on this.
Yeah.
But Moses goes from trying to deliver the one that's being beaten there in
Yeah.
Egypt to
Yeah.
doing it again
Yeah.
over
yeah.
here.
Which
So-
we're going to talk about some more.
which
So,
we'll talk about that.
yeah.
But
It's very
anyway, I
fascinating.
just find it interesting that Moses still has there's still some Egyptian dye in Moses. It's on the outside, but it's also on the inside.
Yeah.
Because Moses is Moses is, for the life that he's going to lead as being a simple shepherd, Moses is so overqualified for the job.
Oh, man. I mean, how many people would not accept a job that they're overqualified for?
Yeah, I mean,
It's like it's beneath them. You know
Moses
what I
is
mean?
probably one of the most qualified people on the planet,
Yeah. Yeah.
and he is sitting by a well,
That's crazy.
and he's
That's a crazy thought.
watering sheep.
Yeah. That's like that person out there who's trying to put out an application, send in their resume, and nothing.
Nothing.
Yeah,
Even when they're qualified.
They've gone through college, graduated, high honors, have the degrees, but still nothing.
Yeah, it reminds me of, like, I don't know if you've ever seen like the black and white pictures of the Great Depression, and you have these businessmen that are in line at the soup kitchen.
Yeah,
And they're all like very
So out of
qualified
place.
individuals, but they've got nothing,
Yeah,
even though they're so qualified to make a good living, but
Yeah.
they can't.
yeah,
And so Moses here is at
Wow.
the mercy of God and other people,
yeah,
even though he's never, I mean, I'm not say never because he's at the mercy of Pharaoh's daughter and
Yeah.
his mother.
yeah.
But,
I mean, he's been taken care of.
He's been just
prior to
fine.
this point. But again, this is a humbling experience.
Oh,
I mean,
yeah.
he's sitting by a well, right? And like we mentioned before, the Israelites, that was the design there as well, so that
Mm-hmm.
they could be humbled. But in this case, Moses is willing to receive,
It's true.
which is a hard thing to do, because when you have been rejected, it's very hard to trust.
Yeah. Like, if for some of us, and probably myself included, I'm not going back there ever again. They can stay in slavery if they want to.
Yeah.
But Moses has, and I think there's a book, Patriarchs and Prophets, talks about this a little bit. Moses has a lot to unlearn. Moses has spent 40 years learning how to be a good leader, but he learned how to be a good leader from Egyptians. Now God is saying, all right, you've learned some really great skills, but let me teach you patience.
Yeah. I wonder if we talked about this earlier, but I wonder if that ever came up, like that thought of like, I'm learning from the people who sold my ancestor.
Yeah, my grandpa.
Yeah. It's like I'm learning about how to take care of sheep, which again, the biblical analogy points to sheep being people a lot.
Oh,
right?
yeah.
I'm learning how to take care of sheep from a group of people that sold.
Mm-hmm.
You know?
Absolutely. And my grandfather was sold to these people.
That's crazy. Oh, bought, not sold. Yeah, I mean, they bought and sold. Yeah, they bought Joseph and sold him to the Ishmaelites. So it's very, very fascinating.
It
how
is.
this
But
story
it's
unfolds.
interesting, too, because Moses, even when he gets there and settled, and we'll talk about that a little bit later, too, but when he has his first son there amongst the Midianites, he calls his son Gershom, and that's interesting because it means I'm a stranger in this foreign land. So even when Moses starts to get settled and starts to put down his roots, he still looks around and says, "This isn't it. Like, this is a foreign place to me, and I'm still very much out of place." So he's out of place in Egypt. He's out of place in Midian.
He's just out of place
He's
altogether.
just still out of place. So pretty much all of Moses' life, we talked about this last episode too, he didn't feel like he belonged with the Israelites or the Egyptians. And now he's in Midian and he feels the same way.
And I think what balanced that out for him was that I think perhaps with Moses, he always felt like he belonged with God.
I hope so. And
Yeah.
I think you're right. I think that may have been why they were so tight. I don't think
I
Moses
think
really
so.
had anybody
I
else.
think so. I mean, because, what we're talking about here is the sense of isolation, right?
Yes,
I mean,
very
you're
much
surrounded
so.
by people, but you can still be isolated. But I think at the end, based on the story that we've been tracing so far, I think God has been so involved in the history of Moses that I don't think Moses ever stopped believing that God was by his side and on his side.
I mean, God
So
had
far.
intervened so many times, like you mentioned. Moses' life had already been saved miraculously. But like I mentioned earlier, it's really easy to forget when you're in the face of the wilderness all the ways that God has provided for you in your past.
Yeah.
We
Yeah.
get so focused on the now that we forget what God has promised to do in the future.
Yeah, yeah.
And I think that happens in personal relationships. And also, again, not to bring it up again, but with our church, sometimes we get so focused on what's going on in our local church right now and the drama that might be happening there right now that may or may not involve us, that we forget the meaning for what our church is there for at all.
Yeah, yeah.
So anyway, that's a very human condition, I think, that we
Yeah.
can all learn from.
I you know what I wish, Garrett? I wish that when I'm hurting, I don't isolate myself as much.
I tend to do that. Usually when I'm hurting, I just
Yeah, you
withdraw.
yeah, that's what we do.
Yeah.
And in some ways, I think the danger of that is if you always isolate, it's very possible that you might isolate from God too.
I think that's the case. I think that's very much the case. You start to get very self-reliant / dependent,
Yeah.
which makes the problem usually even worse.
Exactly. So again, coming back to this knowledge of God that I felt Moses had, right, having read the narrative so far, I think that closeness with God, I'll put it this way. I think there's a psalm that encapsulates this very well.
Okay.
And the psalm is Psalm 46. Psalm 46, I'm going to begin here in verse 8, and then I'm going to jump down to verse 10. Because Psalm 46, verse 8 is an invitation, right?
Mm-hmm.
And perhaps you could look at the desert another way, right? The desert was an invitation for Moses.
Mm-hmm.
Come.
Yeah.
Because he would eventually go back to Egypt and he would say, come to the children of Israel.
Yeah, he'd be the one inviting.
Right, exactly. So I think God was calling him into a space, and I love the fact that Jesus often uses this as well with his disciples, where he would say, "Come apart and let us rest a while."
Yeah.
And these were men that were often prone to making really horrible mistakes,
Sure.
right? And I imagine the desert to have been that, right? It was God's invitation for Moses to come and unlearn, right? Come and learn. Right? Come sit at my feet. Let me teach you, because the knowledge you have that you're depending on right now is not actually going to work for you.
Yeah, it's faulty.
Right? So it says, come, behold the works of the Lord. And again, that thought, God still works in the desert. And so we don't have to look at it with fear. We don't have to look at it with like, oh man, this is going to be a horrible experience. We can say, okay, I am going to take God's invitation and go where he wants me to go in this case, because he's going to work there too. Right? But then it says, verse 10, be still. So first you have activity,
Yep.
come, but then now you're here, be still,
Yeah, stop.
stop. Which I think the other difficulty that I often face in my own experience is that I come, but I'm agitated as I stay.
Yeah, we also just like to be busy, because the busier we are, the less we have to think about problems.
Yeah, exactly. I come, but my anxiety drives me to do stuff. Like
Yeah.
I want to do something, right? Or I want to get out, right? But God says, come. And then it says, be still, right? And then, and know that I am God, right? The one purpose there is your one assignment right now is to know who I am.
Yeah, and that's so much more than just letters on your grandmother's wall or whatever
No,
it is.
yeah,
'Cause
yeah,
those
yeah.
That's a very popular
Yeah,
verse.
yeah.
It's more than that. I mean, it's very much like a Sabbath concept,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
Like, okay, you have all these things, your to-do list is never going to stop, but unless you are still and we can have a conversation and you be quiet
Yeah,
and I can talk to you,
Yeah.
because a conversation is not a monologue.
yeah.
And often I think we treat our prayer life very much like a monologue.
Oh, certainly.
We talk and then we just say, all right.
I'm done, God.
Yeah, it's hard for us to listen.
Yeah, yeah. Like, God, thank you for listening. I also think of Jesus' words in Matthew 11, 28, 29, where he says, come unto me, all you who labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest.
Yeah.
Right. Take my yoke upon you and learn of me. Now, in order for an ox to receive a yoke, that ox has to be still.
That's true. We also like to rest not in storms and deserts.
Well, that's true. We want to rest in an oasis.
We do, but that's not always where. When we're in oases, usually we're not really willing to listen to God.
Yeah. That's very interesting that God actually reintroduced the Sabbath in the desert.
Isn't that interesting?
We're going to come to that.
Yeah, I can't wait for that.
But again, I will be, God goes on, verse 10, I will be exalted among the nations and I will be exalted in the earth.
Yeah.
This exaltation, this understanding of God being high above everything takes place when we come and are still and know who he is, which is very fascinating.
I don't think we're very good at knowing how to be still in today's modern era.
No.
It's really tough.
No.
I mean, even on Sabbath, it's tough, man.
Yeah. I mean, we're pastors.
I mean, yeah, that too. But I see my church members, God bless them. And I mean, Sabbath is busy for everybody, especially when you got kids and you got church responsibilities.
That's true. That's true.
I mean, yeah, it's very difficult for us to actually legit be still.
I wonder how many couples argue on Sabbath.
Bro, Sabbath morning is like Argue Central. It's like, it's laughable, but it's so sad. It's like Satan just wants to mess it up.
It's the day of anxiety.
Yeah, especially
Sometimes,
especially if you don't like people and then you go to church.
Oh, mercy. Yeah.
I love people, so I have a problem with that.
Yeah,
but
likewise,
I'm sure that there's others that, going to church is a challenge.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But man, I think that having that stillness with God helps with the other stuff.
For sure.
And I think that's what stands between Moses and the next chapter of his life, right? It's the 40 years of stillness, right? Before he gets to the other 40 of leading, right? And I think what we're talking about here is that we don't do well in the middle.
Right.
We're good in Egypt with the first 40.
Right.
Right. Horrible in the middle, the second 40, but really good at the last 40. It's like we want to skip the middle part.
Yep. I think it's interesting too, because if you think about it, children of Israel been enslaved for 400 years. End of Exodus chapter 2 says that God heard their groaning. So they've been crying out to God, and for all they know, there's been 400 years of silence.
Yeah.
So I think Moses Moses hasn't really had that. He's been in the wilderness. He's been in the palace.
Yeah.
So now Moses is crying out.
Yeah. Where are you?
What am I supposed to do here? Where are you, God?
So I have another perspective I want to add to this.
Yeah.
And something that I haven't thought about until now, having read this passage so many times. Josephus and a few others mentioned that some of the elders among the Israelites expected, and I think it's also in the book Patriarchs and Prophets, where there is a level of expectation with this Messiah figure.
Oh, for sure.
Just and people understood that Moses was going to be a special case. What happened to them when Moses was gone for 40 years?
It's a great question. I mean, I would think he is gone for good after a year.
Yeah. I mean, their hopes might have been dashed. So they were in their own form of a desert.
Yeah, absolutely. And they're still crying out, God, help, because we're still here.
Yeah.
Yeah,
that's interesting. It's just a very interesting thought. Moses is crying out to God. The people are crying out to God. And prior to now, Moses was probably trying to solve the problem instead of talking to God about it. Now everybody's crying out to God, and God is just, I think at this moment, he's realizing that in order for me to work, this brother needs fixing. Right. But in order for me to work, I need to give my people an opportunity to also speak to me about what they're facing.
And I think that's a great point, because really what's going to happen here in the next few years when Moses gets back to Egypt is the people as well as Moses need to be reintroduced to God.
That's right.
Moses, yes, he's talked to God. Moses has been very faithful to the cause, right? But I don't think Moses at this point really knows God the way that God needs him to know him.
Yeah.
And the children of Israel certainly don't know God anymore.
Yeah.
And so I think God is using this opportunity and saying, if you really want to get to know me, you're going to have to want me.
Yeah. Yeah.
And when you want to get to know me, I'm going to come and get to know you. But do you really want this?
Yeah. Now, I think the other thing too that I might add to that is, and as we wrap things up, is the misunderstanding with regard to stillness. Right?
Okay.
We often think stillness is inactivity.
Yeah.
Right. But in the desert, Moses found a reason to be useful.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Right. He was still a useful guy. right? Even in the desert. And I think sometimes we're like, well, God, until you give me the job opportunity I'm praying for, I'm not going to be looking for anything to do right now.
Yeah, rest is not just Jamaica beaches.
No, it's not. Like we have to ensure that wherever we are, that we're useful for God. And I think that's what Moses learned as well, because growth is, in order for us to grow, part of that growth means we have to be useful in the place that we are now.
Yeah.
And so I remember I had an experience when I was in school studying to be a pastor.
Sure.
I was in college. I went to Heartland College. And man, that was my desert, right? It was a place of isolation. I was in the foothills of Virginia, hidden away. This really small town with a really small group of students. And I remember being so eager to get into ministry.
And out of there. Right. That was my, I mean, literally that's a description of my life. It's like, I want to get there and out of where I am now. Right. Yep. There's always that period of like, man, I can't wait to get out of high school so I can, be an adult and da. Anyway. So while I'm there, man, it's like, I finally discovered something. Why wait to be a pastor when you can be a pastor now? That's it.
And so there I decided, well, Lord, I prayed about it. I'm like, Lord, man, just give me an opportunity to do the work you're calling me to do, not just tomorrow, but today. Teach me how to do it today. And man, it's just that radically changed my experience. Yeah.
And finding enjoyment and fulfillment and helping others. I mean, what does the Bible say? Let's not grow weary of doing good.
Galatians 6:9.
Yeah. So, yeah. And the thing is, often we dread helping others. And actually, like my church is we feed the homeless once a month.
Yeah.
And I'll be honest, for some people, it's kind of hard to get them out the first time.
Yeah.
But man, once they're out there and doing it, they're like, why have I never done this before? This is such a fulfilling experience. And that's just, get out there and do something for Jesus because you'll find rest in it.
Yeah, that's right. And the other thing I would add too is Moses was tending sheep, usefulness. Yeah. But he also had a family.
Oh, absolutely.
He was settling down.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And that really matures you too.
Exactly. Yeah, which you know something about that with your son.
I mean, marriage is an institution within itself, so we both know that.
That's right.
You add a mini you into the mix, and whew.
Yeah,
man. It's I like what you said earlier, not being in such a rush for the next chapter of life, and enjoying the chapter that God has you in now.
Yeah.
is a huge part of rest.
Yeah,
because later in life you'll look back at the good old days.
Yeah, exactly.
And then recognize, wait a minute, I didn't realize they were that when I was living there. And that's a shame.
Yeah, it is a shame. Oh, man, that's unfortunate. Yeah, so now we come to the end of this conversation. And I know we've talked about a lot in the past.
And we promised that we're going to get out of Exodus chapter 2 at some point. We're almost there. I think we have one more episode on that. And then we'll get on to Exodus chapter 3. But we're not in any rush.
I just love the Bible, man, because there's so much you can gain from one text, one passage of scripture. And like I said, we're not in a rush.
Bro, and next week is going to be so good because you'll see the title, but it's a good one.
It's going to be crazy. It's going to be awesome.
I like it.
I want to finish with a statement.
Yeah, go ahead.
One of my favorite books. It's called Ministry of Healing.
Sure.
And the statement goes, the silence of the soul makes more distinct the voice of God.
I mean, that sums it up real nice.
Yeah. Well, and I think that's why God calls us to the desert, so that things around us can be silenced.
Mm-hmm. So maybe you're in the desert right now. Don't despair. Ask what God is trying to teach you. And maybe you need to slow down a little bit in life. Maybe you're not in the desert, but you're like, I'm going too quick. Here's some encouragement to be still.
Yeah. And as you're in the desert, become a good listener.
Yeah.
Tune your ears to heaven's frequency and listen to God speaking to you, and write those things down. Make those experiences a memorable thing. That way you can look back and say, those were the good old days when I really, really felt God close to my side.
Yeah. And we hope that this podcast helps you get a little bit closer to God and hearing his voice and understanding what it is that he has for your life. So we just want to thank you for being a part of our listening family.
And as always, I'm Jermaine.
I'm Garrett.
Thank you for tuning in to Godding Podcast.